Welcome to the College Connection podcast, a podcast presented by the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is the College Connection podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the College Connection podcast, part 3 of our episode, Ask Practice. The College Connection podcast is made available to registered nurses and nurse practitioners to promote good practice and highlight the importance of regulation in healthcare. My name is Kelly Kean, and I'm a registered nurse and a nursing consultant with the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Hi, I'm Michelle Carpenter. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm the other nursing consultant for policy and practice at the college. So, Kelly, we put a call out in notes from the practice team for registrants to ask us questions. So one of the questions that we get quite frequently through practice calls, but also from notes, is I'm a registered nurse and I've been contacted by a virtual care company. Does the college have any guidance on virtual nursing practice?
Yes, yeah, you're right. And especially, during the pandemic, virtual care exploded. And there's still a lot of virtual care that's happening. So we do get questions regularly related to virtual nursing practice. So if you're in Newfoundland and Labrador and you hold a license here in Newfoundland and Labrador and you're providing care virtually to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, we do have a document called, it's about virtual nursing practice, the appropriateness of virtual nursing practice. And the key to remember about providing virtual care is that you're held to the same standards. So the standards of practice for registered nurses and nurse practitioners, you're expected to maintain whether or not the care is in person or virtual. And another key consideration is you're unable to see the client. So your assessment skills must be you need to have really good assessment skills, and you need to ask a lot of questions, of course, because you're unable to visually verify. Now, recognize sometimes there is that video capability as well, virtually, but over the phone, you have to have those really good assessment skills. And if it's determined throughout your assessment that this person, I'm unable to provide the level of care that's needed here virtually, then, that person will need to be seen in person. So we have to remember that, the same standard applies no matter if it's virtual or in person. And making sure that you know how to use the technology, things about privacy and confidentiality. Is the person able to, talk in a private area? Because, if they have family members around, they may not be willing to share everything that they want to share with you. So you have to take those things into consideration when you're engaged in virtual nursing practice. But another question we get related to virtual nursing practice is when it occurs outside of the province. If I'm a registered nurse and I'm registered with the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador, I live in Newfoundland, but I'm providing care virtually to someone in Ontario. The regulatory direction from us is that you must reach out to the regulatory body in that jurisdiction, so in Ontario, so the College of Nurses of Ontario. You would have to reach out to determine if they require you to have a license or not. That direction varies across Canada and it can change. So we don't provide the information of what Ontario requires because that may change on a regular basis. So the registrant must reach out to Ontario to see if they are required to have a license in order to provide care for somebody that's in Ontario. And, a consideration that some registrants, may be surprised to hear, but if you're providing care to someone in Newfoundland, but then they move to Ontario, whether that's permanently or maybe they're there for a few weeks on vacation, but you have to continue to care for that person virtually, you're still expected to contact the College of Nurses of Ontario to determine what their requirements are with respect to providing care for someone who is in their province. So that is what that's what best practice is. That is what is the expectation related to virtual nursing practice. The same as we get questions on a regular basis from registered nurses across Canada who are providing care virtually to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. And we have our virtual nursing practice licensure requirements document that's available on our website. It's in the practice resources, practice topics, and you'll see virtual nursing practice at the bottom. And you can determine, if that person, we direct that person to that document. And then, of course, we encourage a phone call with us to explain anything that they may not be sure of.
Yeah. And Kelly, that's a great point. And we also encourage registered nurses or nurse practitioners to reach out to the Canadian Nurses Protective Society, because again, we're hearing that sometimes with virtual care, they may need more liability protection, but understanding that when you're providing care in other jurisdictions, you may need CNPS liability for that province. Again, it's knowing if you require a license to practice in that jurisdiction. And, I hear you said that we have a virtual nursing practice document. Absolutely. And, it's really important when you're, engaged in virtual nursing practice and you're using these virtual mechanisms, virtual care mechanisms to communicate with your clients, is really understanding how to use that technology. And also, how do you mitigate those cybersecurity requirements, right? So if you have any questions, certainly reach out to us on that and refer to our documents. But, it's really having a clear understanding of how to use the technologies that virtual nursing company provides. And also, as an RN, you may need authorization to perform some of those duties in virtual care. So who is your authorized prescriber? Who is that authorized prescriber able to create care directors or medical directives for RNs in Newfoundland, or the practitioner may be in another province? Does that authorized prescriber need to be licensed with the College of Physicians of Newfoundland and Labrador, Physicians and Surgeons of Newfoundland and Labrador? So certainly reach out to us and look at our resources for sure.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. Michelle, a question related to nurse practitioner practice. So we received a question about ending the NP client relationship. So I'm a nurse practitioner and I provide care to clients in an episodic practice setting. What are my obligations for ending the NP client relationship?
Well, I'll direct NPs to our practice topics under practice resources, practice topics. And in October, the College Council approved 2 new documents for nurse practitioners. One was ending the NP client relationship and NPs closing or leaving practice. So in that first document, ending the NP client relationship, it talks about NPs providing care in an episodic setting. And, NPs may have to provide care to clients in episodic practice setting. That could be through a virtual platform. It could be in a walk-in clinic. So generally, there's the expectation there that this is just for, that one visit, and there's no, expectation that there would be an established, NP client relationship. So the NP isn't under any obligation to adhere to all of those expectations, if there's an established nurse practitioner relationship. But the NP is responsible for developing a follow-up plan. So if you're only going to see this client once, but you've ordered, laboratory tests or diagnostic tests, then, you would need to, as the NP, inform the client, how do they get the results, right? Or you've prescribed a medication, but there's no opportunity for you as the NP to evaluate, the effectiveness of that. So you would advise either the client to follow up with their most responsible provider. But a lot of clients in Newfoundland and Labrador do not have a most responsible provider. So in those circumstances, then they might have to, the NP might have to develop instructions, or, develop a plan of how the client can follow up. So they may be encouraged to reach out to, pardon me, to, emergent or urgent care. They may be, instructed to engage with other healthcare professionals. Then that may be, through contacting another walk-in clinic to get those results. So it's having that follow-up and having a plan for the follow-up and management plan of the clients, and instruct the client how to follow up on those tests, because they may need some adjustments or new medications, and so the client needs to know, right? So, but in that episodic one-off, there is no expectation for all those requirements when you establish a relationship with your client.
Right, and that makes sense. So, I mean, the nurse practitioner is informing the client of how to, follow up. Whether that, like you said, you might have to make arrangements with, another walk-in clinic, or 811, or
Absolutely.
something else. Now, whether or not the client chooses to do that, but that as long as the client is informed of that, of course, the nurse practitioner has no control whether or not the client follows those instructions. So, okay, yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was just going to just add there too, like the NP, like if the client does have a most responsible provider, then there may be like a summary that they forward on to the most responsible provider, right, of what you've done in that, But again, when you're working in a lot of these, in the Newfoundland and Labrador Health Services, there may be employer policies that will direct you to what is expected of you, right? But again, we have our resource there that they can rely on.
And continuing on, kind of on the same topic, we have another question. So it's from somebody who's thinking about leaving their current position with the health authority and taking a position with a private primary care company. What are their responsibilities before leaving their position? And I guess from the question, it's not clear if it's a registered nurse or a nurse practitioner, but can you talk a little bit about those responsibilities?
Yeah, well, again, as I said, we have documents that talk about, for an NP that was recently approved about leaving or closing a practice. And, there may be circumstances, other than leaving your practice, where you might have to end an NP client relationship, and that's detailed in our ending the NP client relationship document. So if that should happen, I would refer the NP to that document. But let's just say the NP is working with Newfoundland and Labrador Health Services, and they've taken a job, a new position with another employer. So they're planning on leaving NLHS. And we'll talk about private in a second, but if you're in the employment setting with NLHS, the first thing is to comply with the employer policies. So, look and see what the expectations are for, cluing up that NP client relationship. So it may, have specific expectations for you, how do you do the documentation? How do you follow up on treatment plans? Getting those things in place to lead. And if there aren't employer policies, I would advise the NP to advocate to the employer to have those expectations laid out in policy should the NP leave an employment setting. Then the next thing is to you really need to facilitate the continuity of care and the transfer of the client records. So it's having that conversation with your manager to say that, okay, this is my client roster, this is my panel, and here are the clients, here is what I have ordered, looking at those management plans that you've established, but then asking the employer, who am I transferring these client records to, this panel to? Because it's the employer responsibility to facilitate that transition to another healthcare provider. And the key here is that once an MP leaves that employment setting, they are no longer within the circle of care. And I'm going to draw the listening audience back to a previous podcast that we did with the Commissioner for Privacy, Information and Privacy earlier in the year that talked very much about being within the circle of care and the ability to access client information. So it's, as I said, I'm going back to having that conversation with the manager to say, okay, here is my client panel. Who am I transferring to? And then facilitating that transfer. So it may mean having conversations with the practitioner who's taking over, but if you're leaving without the individual being identified, then that it's going to be the employer's responsibility to have another authorized prescriber, whoever it is, a physician, another nurse practitioner, to take on that those management plans and to follow up on the laboratory or diagnostic tests or the prescriptions that's been provided. And generally, we say in our document, if you're leaving practice, and this may be, as I said, from an employment setting or self-employment, we generally encourage, there's no best practice on the notice that you give to a client. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons say 90 days or 3 months. That's what they've chosen, and that's based on the Canadian Medical Protective Association. That is what they've identified. And what we've said in our document is that seems that's a reasonable time frame. But the MP uses their clinical decision making, their critical judgment to determine if that's a reasonable amount of time. Particularly if you're working in NLHS and you're leaving, you should communicate with your clients. But again, having that notification, you work that out with your employer of, what is that requirement. And again, what is the process for informing digital health? So as a nurse practitioner within the healthcare system, you're expected to have access to the Health NEL viewer, to access, the pharmacy network, to access your diagnostic laboratory test results, and you do that through that system. So is the process that you notify digital health, or does the employer, the manager, notify that you're no longer within the circle of care? Because you aren't permitted under that FIA legislation, Personal Health Information Act, to access those health records. So we often get questions from MPs, but like, what happens to the follow-up? Well, again, it's the employer's responsibility to set that process in place. Now, there may be an opportunity if there isn't a healthcare professional to, facilitate that transfer. The employer, through a contract, may ask you to stay on for an amount of time until they're, facilitating and that transfer and getting another healthcare practitioner to take over that panel. You may be contracted to provide follow-up and further prescriptions. But if that contract is not permitted, then you are not permitted, because you're no longer within the healthcare, the circle of care, and it's the employer's responsibility then to what happens with that client.
That makes sense. And so so what about those nurse practitioners who aren't with the health authority and may have a private company or private business where in primary care?
Absolutely. So one of the key things in this, and I go back to these documents are 3 and 4 pages long. So to summarize that is difficult to do that in a short question like we have today. Yes. But there are some additional requirements for MPs who are in self-employment. And one is that there should be the NP should proactively plan for those planned or unplanned leave of absence or leaving a practice or closing a practice. There should be a policy in place, and there should be someone who's designated to care and to make those notifications, while we're waiting for that MP to either come back from practice if it's unexpected or if they're leaving. But who is responsible then for the storage of the client's records, right? Because if you're the custodian of those client healthcare records, you have legal responsibilities. So there has to be a process established of what happens to those records, right? And so having those policies written, and there may be a contract that you're in that you have to fulfill. So what are the parameters there of meeting those contractual obligations? And again, you have to notify your client. And again, that is supposed to be in verbal communication, but is also supposed to be in written communication. And that can be in different means. When it's written, it could be a text, it could be a notification on your website. So all of that is detailed there. But if you're in self-employment, then is your responsibility then to contact Digital Health, which was formerly Newfoundland Labrador Centre for Health Information, to say that you are no longer in this practice and that you're not within the circle of care. So the test results should not be sent to you through your email, and they should not be mailed out. So it's really important that that MPs turn their mind to all of the expectations. And also it's really important that MPs document in the client's chart those conversations that they've had with the clients that they're leaving or closing their practice, because that's evidence that you've had those conversations. It's also really important if the NP is able to facilitate that transfer to another healthcare professional. That may not be possible, but work with your client to see if there's other practitioners who are accepting clients, but also working with the client if they secure a most responsible provider to transfer those records. And again, you do that with consent. And it wouldn't be appropriate for an MP, if they're closing or leaving their practice, to take on new clients that would be expected the services to be ongoing if you're going to be closing up. So yeah, that's just some of the things that, like the tops of the trees. There's so much more that we talk about. And
That's right.
Kelly, one thing I forgot to mention is about like prescriptions if you're planning on leaving. We encourage nurse practitioners to adhere to the pharmacy standards on, if that pharmacy will accept a prescription if you've left your practice or are leaving the province. So have those conversations with your clients on, you're going to need your prescriptions renewed, or, they might want to follow up with pharmacy, or, verbally, or they might refer to their standards on, what is best practice when you're leaving a practice, and the continuation of prescriptions.
Absolutely. And there are those documents that you are referring to do outline, a lot of expectations for nurse practitioners. But again, being aware of those expectations is key. And I really like those documents, how you have elements of there, because sometimes there's a breakdown in the relationship as well. It might pose a safety risk to the nurse practitioner to continue caring for a client. And what do they do in these situations? And we can't get into that in today's episode, because it will be the entire episode. But but really good information, because we know things like that may be happening, especially with like narcotics and just those sorts of considerations to make when there's no longer that that good therapeutic relationship occurring with the nurse practitioner and the client. And then like you said, like documenting those conversations with the client as evidence that you've tried to address this, and so that's clearly laid out in the client's chart. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and we do have, it comes down to the NP using their clinical judgment when they have to end a therapeutic client relationship with the client, and that we've highlighted, some of the steps that they should take, trying to resolve the situation and implementing strategies. But there are going to be situations where you may not be able to resolve the situation, and we've outlined that, and we've given examples of when it would be possible or reasonable when an NP would end a therapeutic client relationship. So lots of detail there. They're free to, NPs are free to reach out to either one of us for further clarification. But those, documents will assist, and they're aligned with the College of Physicians of Surgeons and Surgeons of Newfoundland and Labrador as well, because we work in collaborative teams, so they are aligned with the expectations there as well. So so thank you for the question.
Oh, you're welcome.
So Kelly, again, we've got a number of questions that have been posed to us through notes from the practice team. So I think this one goes back to, is now a scope question, because this is our number one question, scope of practice. Am I allowed to do that? So the question was, I was asked to remove a PICC line, and I learned about it in nursing school, but I have not had the opportunity to perform this competency since I graduated 4 years ago. Am I allowed to do that?
Yes, that is a very common question that we have, and going right back to scope of practice framework. So for this particular situation related to the PICC, so when we look at the scope of practice framework, we've already, throughout this series of Ask Practice, we've already touched on those 3 key elements: educated, authorized, and competent. So for this person with the PICC, it sounds like they received some education in school, but they're questioning their competence in that task now. But we'll just start with education. So of course, education is what you learn in your entry-level competencies, and when you graduate, you write your exam, and you're tested on those entry-level competencies. But that's not to say you can't build competencies as you go. So we recognize that there's continuing education as well, and that could be formal, like doing a formal course, like and just going back to RN prescribing from our last episode, where you're doing that formal education, and there's a practicum there as well that you need to do, your preceptorship, so you're getting that theory and practice. But you can also think about informal ways of learning, where you're meeting with the clinical educator. It could be looking up a medication that you haven't given before, because of course you're expected to know everything that you need to know before you administer that medication. So it can be formal and informal, but the key piece of information when it's continuing education, you need to have theory, but you need to have an opportunity for practice as well. So I'm thinking about if you've never done peritoneal dialysis before, you may have touched on it in your entry-level competencies, to learn about it a little bit, may have even practiced a little bit in lab. But let's say if you if you haven't done it in a while, the clinical educator on your unit reviews peritoneal dialysis with you, that theory part. You need to have that opportunity to practice as well. So usually you would observe, and then someone would observe you. We don't set a number of times that you need to do something in order to be validated. We don't determine that, but you do need to have that opportunity to practice before you can go ahead and do that. So that's the education piece. Then it's the authorization, and there's 4 types of authorization. So first and foremost, we look to legislation. So is there anything in legislation that's restricting RNs or NPs from doing a certain thing? Thinking about drug samples. Registered nurses, and going back to your RN prescribing in the second episode. So registered nurses, by law, in legislation, are not allowed to give out drug samples. Nurse practitioners are authorized to do that in legislation, but not registered nurses. So that's something that a registered nurse can't do, because they don't have the authorization in legislation. You need to have the authorization in legislation. Then you also need to have employer authorization as well. So, most often employer authorization occurs through policies, but it could also be, care directives or processes, or orders for you to be carrying out, whatever it is that the client requires. For employer policies, in some settings, you may not be able to do certain things. So, if I'm working on a medicine unit in acute care, yeah, I can go ahead and administer blood and blood products. But if I'm working in long-term care, am I permitted to do that in that practice area? So you have to look at employer policy if they are authorizing you to do that particular thing. For PICC lines, in particular for this person, what does the employer say about removing a PICC line? Are you in the person's home, like in a rural community where the nearest hospital is a couple hours away? And, are you able to manage those outcomes of care in that setting? Whereas if you're in an acute care setting, you have those resources around to, to support anything that may happen. And then, of course, authorization through the regulatory body as well. And for our listening audience, you may or may not be aware, but the College of Registered Nurses, we have a very broad scope of practice, right, where we do look at these three elements. For registered nurses, we grant, I'm just going to give an example again of RN prescribing. So we grant that authority for an RN prescriber once they have successfully completed that education and preceptorship. They apply, and we give that authority to them. But we have a very broad scope of practice. So if you have any questions in particular, we encourage you to contact Michelle and I. And then finally, of course, authorization through the client through informed consent. You have to make sure that the client consents to whatever it is that you need to do for them. So that's the authorization, and you have to have authorization in each of those. So even if one, like if legislation says you can't do it, then you can't do it. And if employer policy says you can't do it, well, then you can't do it, right? Even if in legislation you can. And then finally is competence. So do you have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment? So yeah, I did the education, and yeah, I removed a few PICCs back 6 years ago. But I haven't done it in a while. Do I know what best practices are today? Reflect on, am I really competent in that? And if the answer is no, well, then you would seek to obtain that necessary knowledge, skill, and judgment in order to carry that out. But a big piece is, can you manage the outcomes of care under competence as well? So, you may be able to, do something for the client, but do you have those resources around you to manage the outcomes of care? Is there an authorized prescriber that you're able to contact should you need any direction if something, were to occur to the client that you didn't expect? So that's what we use for the scope of practice framework. So for this particular person, with removing the PICC, they had the education as part of their entry-level competencies, but 4 years ago, I would take a look at, do I have the necessary knowledge, skill, and judgment to do that today? Am I aware of what products do I use? How long do you apply pressure after? Because things like that change all the time. So you have to be aware of what best practices are. So it's never a yes/no when it comes to scope of practice questions. We work with the registrant to work through those questions and reflect on those questions to come up with that answer. Very rarely it's very rare that we say yes or no, unless it's in legislation, of course. But we work with the registrant to work through that framework so that they can reach that conclusion themselves.
Yeah, and Kelly, it's really interesting. You talked about the PICC line in acute care, and the question was in a home care agency in the client's home. So I guess the key here is being able to, the registered nurse to reflect on, are they able to manage the outcomes of care? Because in the client's home, as you said, even if you were 20, 30 minutes away and this client starts to, hemorrhage from taking out the, central venous access device, the PICC line, are you going to be able to manage the care while you're waiting for an ambulance to come, right? So it's thinking about, and does the home care agency authorize you to take out that PICC line in the client's home? Because again, it's having those resources to be able to support you to be able to safely perform that competency PICC line and being able to manage the outcomes of care. So
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to assist registered nurses and nurse practitioners, we have the scope of practice framework on our website under practice topics for a scope of practice, but we also have a suite of supporting documents, right? So we have a care directive and pre-printed orders. We have a one-pager that talks about those three elements that you talked about, Kelly. So, sometimes, if you're late at night, you might not have all the time to read the scope of practice framework, which is about 10 pages, but that one-pager very quickly talks about what it means to be educated, what it means to be competent, what it means to be authorized. And we also have a supporting document that allows the registered nurse to reflect on a number of reflective questions to answer that question. Am I allowed to do that? Mm-hmm. And also, we get a lot of questions, Kelly, about adding new yes. and emerging competencies to the scope of practice of the registered nurse or nurse practitioner. So we have a document because we have, the college has delegated that responsibility to the employer. So there's a decision-making framework that they can use to add, a new competency into the scope of nursing practice. Those are things that you can work with your employer. So there's certain things that should be in place for you to bring that into your individual competence and into the scope of those that are on your unit. So those are just some of the documents I wanted to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and it's a really good, for registrants to be aware of that scope of practice framework, because we know what happens out in practice. There's a lot of pressure. A physician may come around, or a manager may be coming around and asking you to do something that you're questioning. And these documents are there to support you to be able to have those knowledgeable conversations with the people who are asking you to do that. And yes, I can do this, but I need to have this in place first before I am able to carry out that care safely. So it's just a really good idea for registrants to be familiar with that framework. Okay. Michelle, the final question that we have to conclude our Ask Practice series is from a registered nurse, as a community care nurse. So this person writes, I'm a community care nurse and I've been asked to go into a client's home on behalf of a home care agency to delegate insulin administration to a home care worker. What do I need to know?
Thanks, Kelly. And I'm going to refer the listening audience to our document called Unregulated Care Providers in Community Settings. And the first thing I think that in the healthcare system and in the community, there's been a lot of confusion about the word delegation. And so I think the registered nurse, the first determination is, what form of authorization am I truly doing? Because when you're going in to authorize an unregulated care provider, you are authorizing the unregulated care provider to do a nursing test that was not in their education program, right? So, and they are not able to do a nursing assessment. So the nurse has to make a determination first of what are the client care needs? Is this a predictable, stable client that the nurse would be able to authorize an unregulated care provider to perform that nursing task? So I would clarify with my employer, if I was going into authorize the home care worker, is, am I doing authorization by assistance? Am I doing it through direction? Or am I doing a true delegation? And I'm going to explain these. So authorization by assistance means that the client or the family member is responsible for the outcomes of that care by the home care worker. So there's many times where the client may not be able to do insulin administration due to a physical disability or an ailment or condition of their hands. They may not be able to do it. But the RN goes in and assesses the client, but also determines the competence of the unregulated care provider. So that nurse is responsible to say, yep, this is a person that I can now provide theory and practical to this unregulated care provider to do insulin administration. So the RN goes in, teaches the competency to the home care worker, The home care worker is instructed on what to look for, and also what to do if there's the client's condition changes, or there's, if someone, for example, the client is having hypoglycemic episodes or hyperglycemic episodes. That gives instruction. The RN gives that knowledge to the unregulated care provider of what to do. So in the authorization by assistance, the home care worker would say, okay, Mr. Jones is sugar is 3.2. I think we need to the family member, I think we need to call the ambulance to get, or we need to make an appointment, or I'm noticing some redness around Mr. Jones's toe. I think you should get an appointment with, the family doctor, right? So all the RN is doing there is authorizing that UCP to perform that nursing task and ensuring that validating that they have the competency to do that, and to outline what is expected of that home care worker to do if there's a change in the client's status. So that's either, the client will call their physician or nurse practitioner, or the family member. And then we get into authorization by direction. And this is typically when, a home care agency or a personal care home, or it could be like a school environment where there's home care workers in caring for students in the schools, where that agency or that employment setting, the leader of that employment setting is responsible should something occur with the client's care. So in authorization by direction, the nurse practitioner again goes in and provides education on insulin administration. They validate that the unregulated care provider, home care worker, has the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment to perform that skill. But again, the parameters are put in place of who does the home care worker notify should the client's care or client's response be unexpected and things are changing. So in this circumstance, authorization by direction, the home care worker would call the home care agency, and that could be the owner of the agency then would call the ambulance. So in the first two examples, the RN is only simply doing her assessment and authorizing the home care worker to perform that competency. And there are other designated most responsible people to follow up. In a true delegation, the RN, authorization by delegation, the RN, in this circumstance, if it's a true delegation, the RN, on behalf of the home care agency, they're going in, they're assessing the client, and providing education to the home care worker. They've deemed that this, they provided the education, they deemed that this person is competent, they're validated this, they've documented this, that the home care worker is responsible. But should something change in the client status, then that home care worker is actually calling the registered nurse who has done that delegation. Also, the RN is responsible to go in and provide assessment of the client. How are they responding to the care that the unregulated care provider is providing? Also, is their responsibility to determine, does that home care worker still have all the best practices, and they have that competence. So if they notice that, the home care worker is taking steps that's not what should be done, they had to do re-education, right? So it's being really clear on what type of authorization is responsible. And in a delegation, the RN remains responsible for the client's outcomes and also the care that is provided by the home care worker. This is a really complex situation. It's complex, and there's a lot of confution with saying what that
terminology.
The terminology.
Quite often the word delegation is used for everything.
Absolutely.
Even when we talk about assignment of care, and I know I'm getting off track a little, but registered nurses don't delegate to licensed practical nurses ever.
No.
We assign care.
Absolutely.
so I think it's a language.
Yes.
A lot of those words are being used interchangeably. So it's not necessarily that you're delegating to a UCP. You're authorizing a UCP. Now, are you doing it through assistance, direction, or delegation? And you have to determine what one that is. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kelly, in that document that I talked about, there's actually some reflective questions for the RN to use for selecting the appropriate method of authorization. Because at the end of the day, first of all, it's really important for the RN to document all the education, whatever they have, provided to the UCP, but it's the RN's also responsibility to say if that authorization is appropriate for either that client or for that unregulated care provider. And in addition, the authorizations are client specific. So an own care agency can't expect a registered nurse to go in and do an authorization for an insulin administration, just show every home care worker, how to do insulin administration. It's client specific. So the RN does an assessment of that specific client. They might have to do multiple authorizations for multiple clients, but that RN is assessing the client and the home care worker, and is only in the delegation where they're responsible for the follow-up on the UCP's maintaining competency, but also the outcomes of care. And that's who would be notified if the client status changes.
Absolutely. And you made a good point there too, because there's sometimes when they're authorizing to a UCP may never be, whether it's assistance, direction, or delegation, depending on the client. I mean, like you said, predictability, and, maybe they're very complex. I'm thinking maybe this client is having all kinds of glucometer readings all over the place. They're low one minute, they're high the next minute. And there's no predictability whatsoever. There's probably something going on. Something else. Oh, maybe they got an infection somewhere or something like that. Is that appropriate in that circumstance where it may need to be the regulated healthcare professional who delivers that care for a little while until they can get somewhere where outcomes are a little bit more predictable, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Kelly. And this ends the part 3 of Ask Practice. And so we encourage the listening audience to stay tuned for our next episode of the College Connection podcast. And feel free to reach out to us at any time if you have any questions. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
This has been a presentation of the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador.